has questions? Todd.
Really quick, Annie, how are you defining peasant?
Oh, excellent question. In a real sort of offhand sort of way, smallholder farmers are under 2 hectares of land apiece, rural workers, landless rural workers, people who reside in rural areas and have livelihoods that...
Say it louder.
Correct.
Sorry, I'm usually loud enough. This is usually not my problem. I say the question was, how do we define peasants? And my answer was sort of in an offhand sort of way, smallholder farmers on under 2 hectares of land, landless rural workers, workers who have part of their livelihood or family connections that are in rural areas that migrate to the cities and that come back home, lives that are split between city and country. Those are all very much part of the new peasantries in the world.
And this is not a question, this is just to say about peasants. I live in a rural community, and my friends are peasants, right? And I don't think, I would like to hear more emphasis from, I think we did hear some from you, about how there is a peasantry in our country, and that it's a very, very strong backbone of our country, actually, and should be supported as much as peasantry in other countries. So, sorry, that wasn't a question.
Right. The Europeans have sort of figured that out, and we have not figured that out in that language here.
Yeah, the term peasant has pretty negative connotations here. I'm loud enough, I'm good.
You're loud.
I'm always loud enough. Yeah. I saw a question, oh wait,
No,
Eric,
just
go ahead.
quickly, I mean, there's been a process of de-peasantization, it's clear, but as Annie pointed out, we have more peasants now than we ever have in the history of the world. So there's a process of re-peasantization. The problem with the process of re-peasantization is that people are being re-peasantized in fragmented ways into communities which are hanging on by a thread. In other words, the relations of peasant production villages don't exist as they did before. And so if we're talking about supporting the peasantry, it's very much about reconstructing village structures in the north and in the south. Otherwise, I don't think there's no way for peasants to survive.
And a distribution network, because that's the difficulty with the small landholders in my area, is there are no places to, slaughterhouses. There are no slaughterhouses that they're federally allowed to bring their cows to. There's nowhere to send out their food.
Yeah.
Anyway.
We have a question over here.
Yeah, just building off that, I wanted to ask y'all about how y'all feel of the Green New Deal and also recent discussions of a Democratic candidate actually discussing farms, and also maybe an anarchist interpretation of how that might play out, because it is, at least in my generation, the first time I've heard a presidential candidate bring up farmers in a way that wasn't about like corn and soy and etc.
And let's get a second question so we can do a piggyback. Yes?
Yeah, my question is the way in which you use the agrarian question and its relevance for the so-called global north, right? Because here you have highly intensive agribusiness, large scale, and because quickly, the way in which the agrarian question is being constructed by academia is very mechanistic. Transition to capitalism, and then that's the end, right? The great Henry Bernstein of the 21st century is one of those. So I'm just thinking, if that is the case, how would you conceptualize the agrarian question in the 21st century, particularly for the global north?
Reconceptualize the agrarian question. We've
2
got
minutes.
2 minutes. Go. Who's got the mic for that one?
I think that's a great question.
I think Annie, he's passed you the mic. The baton is now yours.
Well, we can tag team this here. Reconceptualizing the agrarian question for our present moment, I think there's a couple things. I was just out in Kansas last month. Average income on a Kansas farm, which is 2,300 acres, is a small farm in Kansas, minus $17,000 for the last 3 years. So what counts as a small farm in this country is really, we have to have a different discussion about that. More than that, if we're talking about a broader agrarian question in the world, we have questions of ecology that the original agrarian question did not really address. The sort of fundamental biological basis of agriculture being undermined around the world. And then we've got the sort of question of politics, right? Originally was what happens to the peasantry under capitalism, and what kinds of political actors might the peasantry be? Was part of that formulation, and the rise of right-wing populism really makes us have to rethink this question. one of Antonio's colleagues at ISS in The Hague just put out this great piece on sort of rise of right-wing agrarian populism, the support for fascists in rural areas across Europe and North America, and the possibilities for an agrarian populism that sort of turns that tide that addresses some of the de-investment and extraction that's happened from rural areas. So I think that political question of what kind of actors are rural people and the ecological question need to be really central. And Henry Bernstein is great, but he is so dogmatic in terms of his formulation of it. And just the sheer numbers, especially in places like China and Southeast Asia, of people who are remaining on the land would sort of put a lie to that theory.
That piece is open access in Journal of Peasant Studies by June Boris.
Journal of Agrarian Change.
Journal of Agrarian Change, sorry.
But still,
Yes. Yes.
No, I would also say that the agrarian question, particularly in the North, but not exclusively, goes beyond agriculture. I mean, it always did. But in fact, now more specifically, it's more of a food systems question. Because of the fact that we have more people in prison in the United States than we have on the land, less than 2% of the population. So they have farms in this country. So they have no political power whatsoever. So if there are going to be any sort of structural changes in addressing agrarian issues, it has to be on the basis of alliances with people who are not farmers. And that's where I think the food movement has actually opened up some very interesting conversations and possibilities. So that the agrarian question brings to bear on the food system as a whole. Otherwise, I think there's no practical social political way to address it. And if you go to pick up on your question about the Green New Deal, go back to the Wisconsin Farmers Union, the Texas Farmers Union, the National Farmers Union. They're still there. They've been there since 1910, 1915, and they are still demanding the same things. And the Green New Deal, thanks to, needs to incorporate them. And Bernie Sanders somehow hooked up with the right people and said, okay, we need parity. We need supply management. This has to be conditioned on environmental regulations. And we need antitrust. Those are the pillars for, real agrarian transformation. And if the Green New Deal incorporates those, and a lot of people are saying that they should, then I think we have a very different playing field. Political playing field.
Do you want to address the?
Well, so just to put it out there, Milo and I and Annie is also part of a group of scholars who have basically been working. One of the projects we've been working on is partnering with various social movement groups around issues of the Green New Deal. So I think it sort of answered the question of what does it mean to have these presidential candidates actually talking about these and taking sort of perspectives that have long been pushed for in the farm justice sort of wing of food movements. I think it's very meaningful because I think that most often the dominant narratives around food and farming, especially from those on the oh-so-righteous coasts, tends to be very dismissive of and not even understanding the dynamics of Midwest agriculture. I think that's what a lot of Eric's work has been about, talking about overproduction as an actual fundamental part of the problem that doesn't serve farmers either, and recognizing farmers as victims of a system rather than perpetrators of it, I think is a key step towards making those larger alliances. And from the anarchist position, I guess, we're supposed to say we don't give a shit, it's electoral and we don't, it always sucks. But in actuality, I think what it really shows is that it's important for people to maintain these kinds of social movement orientations that stick around regardless of the over political circumstances. So parity is an idea that has gone out of style, but we've had a lot of people maintain the notion that being a farmer is actually a righteous thing and that we should not be all pushed off of the land. And so parity is one means towards that end. And so I definitely think that, at least from my personal perspective, I'm willing to work on Green New Deal politics, not so much because I think that it's actually going to end up in great legislation that's going to somehow save us all, but rather the process of achieving these greater affinities between different groups and understandings of different political and social positions, and this actually getting a systemic read on food systems challenges and their solutions is going to be key no matter what the political situation is. And so the Green New Deal discussion opens up a lot of opportunities for those kinds of alignments where they haven't been in the past. And so I find that very hopeful and generative, even if I'm personally pretty cynical about what the federal system is going to end up with in terms of legislation.
Your internal contradictions. Do you want to add?
Just one
Yeah.
kind of brief addendum there. So I think in conversations that we've been a part of so far with many food and agriculture civil society organizations, a very strong possibility is that folks start talking about decarbonizing agriculture and it gets swept up into climate smart agriculture, robots, precision ag, and that quickly wins the game because that gets at what they want is carbon neutrality. So, and also people in Washington DC, perhaps ignorant, well-intentioned, or malignantly want to ask scholars like folks who work on agroecology to give them policy. And so we're trying to kind of get ahead of that tide and say, like, actually we need to connect to the National Family Farm Coalition, to people who have been working on this for decades, to make those critical alliances between farm justice and food justice organizations, and kind of ensure that what always happens is that the big NGOs and the scholars start pushing policy before we've had these conversations and connected to grassroots movements on the ground. So it's a huge ball of wax and lots of different, I think what Eric put it really well is kind of these situated utopias. You see those that fragmentation of that landscape is everyone talking about Green New Deal now, and how do we get into that? So trying to make sense of that is I think a big challenge, but hopefully generative and kind of the process of thinking, overcoming it. So thank you.
Okay. I think it is time for lunch. But if people want to stay, we can. We're going to start the next panel at the scheduled time we ran over in the morning. So 1:25, we'll see you back here.